good morning. Which, of course, is not what that says. My hurry to shorten this presentation, I forgot to actually change the title. But I think that you all can relate to it, because it's probably a little more contextual. This paper came about because Jack Pennington actually invited me up here to give a talk to a group of volunteers. And he said, it was in February, which happened to be African American History Month, and he said, would you be willing to talk about African American history in the Grand Canyon? I said, sure. This was November. I had no idea what I was going to talk about. Not at all. But I delved into it, and I'm an archaeologist. I'm not a historian. So as an archaeologist, we don't do anything unless we have a research question attached to it. So my research question when I delved into this was, what were the mechanisms that brought African Americans to this region, and what were their lives like here in this region, particularly African Americans in the West, because it is a completely different experience when you're African American in the West than, say, the South. So that is basically the premise I started on when I started delving into the history of this. And when you're talking about African Americans or Africans, or people of African descent in the Southwest, you really have to go back to Spain and Portugal. You're all historians, or you are interested in history, so you're probably aware that the early Spanish had a strong economic and social relationship with Africa and Northern Africa, and when they came to the New World, they brought Africans with them. They brought African people, they brought African products, they brought African culture with them to the New World. So really the first African culture that came here was with the early Spanish explorers. So many of the early Africans were probably never really well documented, but there are a few who were. For instance, Esteban here, and some of you probably are more familiar with that history than I am, an early African American who was a slave, ended up in this interesting situation for 7 years in Florida, then finally made his way to what is now Sinaloa, Mexico, and was asked to go north. Africans were thought to have a great ear for languages, so they were quite often times brought in on expeditions, early expeditions, because they thought that they could help translate. So Esteban was asked to go north to look for, of course, gold and other economic and resource opportunities. And so apparently he made it as far north as Hopi, but was killed on that expedition. And later on, you see in places like in California, here in the Southwest, where people of African descent were actually socially accepted. Here, if you're from California like I am, you know about Pio Pico, who was in fact the last governor in California. He was of African descent. His family were rancheros. So socially, Africans did have a place in the social order, but not to suggest that there weren't also African slaves. There were. However, you do see that African culture did come in a lot earlier than a lot of people realize. So by the 1864s, you get into, or 1860s, you get into the opening in the West. Of course, we went through this little war that happened on California, which opened up the West, and the government immediately wanted people to go out there and make it easily accessible. So for those of us who are from this region, you certainly know about the Beale Wagon Road, which is located just about 30 miles south of here on the Kaibab National Forest. Well, we have a portion of it, let's say. But it actually is one of the major routes for people coming out of the east to go to the west. It becomes an economic route, as well as a social route, allowing people access to California, the gold mines, and other economic opportunities that are happening in California. So that brings a lot of people to this region who would not have realized what kinds of resources were available here, like the Grand Canyon just north of this road. My pointing is right. Ah. Where am I? Yeah, it's not. Ah. Not pointing all left. So some of the early Africans who made their way to the West, some of these people, obviously way more than the 4 people we're seeing in these photos, but these are the people who are known. Biddy Mason, who was brought out, she was a slave. One of the earliest problems when the West opened up was the question of slavery and the expansion of slavery into the West, and whether or not new states would actually be forced to become slave states or not. So there was a compromise that was made roughly about 1850, which basically said, all right, you guys in the West, you decide for yourselves what you want to be. So it gave communities an opportunity as to whether or not they choose to continue with slavery or not. Biddy Mason was brought to California. She was a slave. She was actually a slave to a Mormon gentleman. Mormons actually did continue with slavery in Utah. So she was brought down to California, to San Bernardino area, which had a large Mormon population. She was told that she was still enslaved when in fact California was a free state, and she sued for her freedom in California courts. The fact that it was allowed in California courts is pretty amazing, but California always has been that kind of liberal place. However, and there were other people such as James Beckworth, who was a trapper, well-known, who had spent many time with the Crow Indians and other Indians. He spent time walking around the Southwest. There is a canyon along the Sierra Nevadas that is actually named for him. And then here you have Amanda and Samuel, and they themselves were actually Mormons. And people don't realize that when the Mormons came to Utah, not only brought in free blacks, but they also had slaves that they brought with them and continue to have slavery in Utah. So the early Arizona census, you can really see that, and it's interesting, they note that you have 21 free in 1860, which means they're not recognizing the people of African descent who are with the Spanish communities who are here. And then right about 1890, you see a very big jump in the population, and there's a distinct reason for that. But before we get into what that's all about, you have to think about what the Western experience was for African Americans. And for those of us who are a certain age who remember these early cartoons, and this my favorite one around Christmas, where you have the little elf who talks about wanting to be a dentist, and his father keeps telling him that no, elves aren't dentists. This is not what you do. And this is exactly the kind of experience or the idea in terms of African Americans and people of color, really, not just African Americans in the West. You were accepted in certain economic and social roles, but you could not step out of those roles. So the system set it up so it's perfectly okay for African men to be cowboys, to be cooks, to be in certain roles, but beyond that, that was the glass ceiling. So that is the experience of the African American in the West. We don't have the same Jim Crow laws that were developed after the Civil War, but there is still a systemic racism that is here, even if it's not nearly as covert or overt as Jim Crow laws. So, and it was supported by social mores, by social things, social activities like the newspaper, for instance. So the Williams News would do these serial stories, which would include, of course, these kinds of images of black people. Even though there were very few black people here, they still had access to these types of images, which helped to color their views about black people. So again, this system was here, and it only became strengthened through time. But African Americans were used as part of the early exploration. You can see a lot of the early explorations of the Colorado River and other types of overland explorations. African Americans were often part of those expeditions, if not to help cook or do the boat. They were still here. They were a part of that. A lot of people don't realize that they ran steamboats. Before the railroad came to Arizona, the only way to actually get resources into the central part of Arizona was to bring them from California. They actually ran steamboats up the Colorado River from Yuma to places like La Paz. Of course, by this point, by 1870s, 1880s, you've got Jerome and Mingus Mountain area with copper and other, also a lot of cattle is coming in. So they needed to get resources. So, of course, who knew how to actually run steamboats? Well, you borrow them from Mississippi. And so there were black people who were brought in to help as laborers as part of this system. Back to the systemic, a lot of people think about, when you talk about blacks in the West, you think about black cowboys. And there certainly were black cowboys in Arizona, but not in the same percentage as you would see in Texas. They're very well known for having been part of the big migration, the cattle drives going up to Wyoming, and you certainly see that whole aspect of African Americans post-Civil War. Here in Arizona, not that there weren't black cowboys, there certainly were, but there certainly weren't in the same quantity. And in this situation, you can see this gentleman, let's see, there, who is probably a cook. Again, a socially acceptable role for a black man at this time. So here is why you see a huge increase in the population right about 1880s or so, and that is because the Buffalo Soldiers were brought in. They are, again, back to Mingus Mountain and other economic pursuits that are beginning to develop at this time. There is a little issue with conflict with the native people who were here, and so they wanted to have a stronger military presence, and so troops of Buffalo Soldiers were brought in. Initially, one of the first troops were actually at Fort Whipple down in Prescott. And then also were brought in and were stationed at Fort Verde in the Verde Valley, of course, on both sides of Jerome. There you go. And they were there for 1 or 2 years. The other thing that the forts allowed for is they would actually employ black people. So this couple most likely were cooks, laundry, the woman's probably a laundress, that type of, so another opportunities for black people in this region. There we go. Buffalo Soldiers, so most of you guys are probably well aware of Fort Huachuca in southern Arizona. That was actually established a little later than Fort Verde and Whipple. However, this became the major hub for many of the cavalry for African Americans, and certainly they were brought to the north, certainly patrolled up in the northern part of the state. There's a reason why they're down on the border, however, because they absolutely were used as a major military presence along the U.S.-Mexican border. And they were, in fact, their early, we call border patrol. But they certainly worked up in this region. The railroad comes in right about the 1880s. The Atlantic Pacific, of course, is the first one through here, which was later bought by the Atchison and Topeka. But most of you know that railroads definitely employed African Americans. In the South, African Americans were the primary laborers for building the railroads. Here in the West, it was actually more Asian, Chinese, Irish people who were used, Mexican laborers who were mainly used for building the railroads here. But African Americans were certainly used as porters and other service people on the railroad. The lumber industry, of course, is what helped to spur when the railroad came in, that spurred the lumber industry. Saginaw Manistee Mill in Williams, Arizona would not hire African Americans. They felt that they weren't physically up to the work. However, other mills in Flagstaff actually did hire African Americans very early on. The railroad, as I said, railroad porters, African American porters. There's in fact the African American porter became a union where that job was very well protected for African Americans. And so, as the railroad developed here, and later, of course, the railroad was moved up towards the canyon, African Americans were brought in with the railroad to help service the railroad and as part of that system. The Fred Harvey company was an early, they were one of the first who came in and developed the tourism, helped to develop the tourism here in the Grand Canyon. And one of the things about the Fred Harvey system, or Fred Harvey himself, was they had a philosophy of treating everybody equally. They did not discriminate. He hired a lot of people of color. And what people don't realize is that when Fred Harvey first started out with his restaurants and hotels, the servers, his early servers, were actually African Americans. But by this point, you had a lot of Southerners who objected to being served by African Americans. So that is actually what spurred the development of the Harvey girls, was to try and address this issue, and they limited the amount of African Americans that continue to be servicing the public. Though the Harvey girls were obviously what was most famous, if you take a look at the U.S. Census, especially in places like Seligman, Ash Fork, that are just west of here, even in Williams, if you go through the census and they walk through and take everybody's information, the Harvey system is still hiring and still using African American service wait people, but certainly not in the quantity that they are young women. Also, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, Fred Harvey, these hotels actually did take black and other people of color as customers in a time when other major businesses did not. And that does play quite a role later on. When talking about people of color, and particularly when it comes to the canyon, you're talking about mainly tourism, especially by the turn of the century. We're talking the major industry here is tourism. Mining and those other opportunities are certainly waning, but tourism becomes the issue. And with tourism, the canyon is not its own entity. It is actually supported very much by other communities that are near the canyon, Williams being one of them. Williams was is still known as the gateway to the Grand Canyon. Many people who intended to be tourists in the Grand Canyon also stopped in Flagstaff, and so they built up a economic base to support the tourism of the Grand Canyon. And it's in these places that you see a lot of people of color. In Flagstaff, you see women who are working as wait people, domestics in hotels. And in Williams, you also see a bit of a black population. Despite the fact that the biggest employer did not employ black people were employed in the local restaurants. There were women of color who were prostitutes. And yes, we had our own, if anybody's been to Williams, the Red Garter was in fact a house of ill repute. And interestingly enough, Percy Taylor, and that's a story in itself I don't have time to go into, but he was a quintessential middle-class black person who worked for Fred Harvey. He ran their electrical system, and he and his wife were very much middle class, and then were treated as middle-class members of the Williams Society. So their comings and goings were actually noted in the newspaper and the society page. So they were very much treated very close to it. And other great people. These two gentlemen, Archie Mills and James Duncan, were themselves Buffalo soldiers who made their way back and retired in Williams. And you can definitely see that one of the things, you have black people working in the canyon, but they probably came to Williams because there was a black population there to socialize. Yeah, I know. So, I've been told 2 minutes, so I'm going to move this up. All right, so you see the population is changing. One of the things that happens in 1909 is the school systems are segregated in Williams. With the exception of the high schools. The elementary schools were segregated. The high schools were not. They assumed that people of color wouldn't make it to high school. But if you had less than 9 students, you didn't have to have a separate school. So Williams didn't have a separate black school, but Flagstaff did. And then you also see a big migration of African Americans coming in as part of the mining. And right about 1950s, the 1940s, you actually see a large population come in because from the south, because they actually had opportunities to work in the logging. And I'm going a little too fast, but let's go back to the CCC. The CCC program was actually integrated up until 1935. I'm getting it. Okay. And this is actually my last slide, real quickly. when cars become available for African Americans traveling, this becomes a major opportunity because freedom for you. If you don't want to deal with clashes in terms of racism, if you can be in your own car, that's great until you have to get gas. So, but the best part about it, stop now. Okay. I will definitely stop now.